Well, this is sort of, I regard this as the freebie lecture that you could sit out if you had a massage, because it's just sort of it's something which I discovered is one way of putting it, or dreamed up is another. And it's, if nothing else, it demonstrates the slippery nature of ideas. And I, depending on the audience I'm talking to, I present it different ways. Like sometimes I present it as God's truth. And then, like in Austria at this art thing, I presented it as a work of conceptual art. Yes, safer, right? So, and it's a concept, it's an idea that small computers, such as we're looking at, came along just in time, or about 5 years after I first needed them. So I'll just sort of talk about it a little bit and feel my way into it. It's more fun to play with than to discuss the theoretics of. But if you don't, if you don't have some appreciation for the theory, then it doesn't make any sense at all. The basic notion is, or the way in which this idea parts company from ordinary science, is there is the idea that there is something which has been overlooked in the categorizing of the forces which shape and maintain the cosmos. Something has been overlooked. And I call this something novelty, following Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy as put forth in Process and Reality. So novelty, and one way of thinking of it, if you have a Tao talking about here, is pretty much something like the Tao, but we are going to call it novelty. And it comes and goes in the world according to mysterious and unfathomable rules. And it builds structure up, dynastic families, corporations, nation states, and it pulls structure down according to some whim or some unimaginable algorithm or previously unimaginable algorithm. And part of what got me started thinking along these lines was simply trying to make mathematical models of Tao. In other words, taking the statements at the beginning of the Tao Te Ching and taking them as mathematical formalisms, and then seeing what the constraints were on a system that operated along those lines. Well, eventually that led me to look at the I Ching, which is sort of the text par excellence relative to this idea that time has qualities. And this idea of the ebb and flow of novelty that I was playing with, I discovered was a notion that was very old in the East. It's not a notion that's even tolerated in Western thinking, because science, in order to do its business, must have the assumption that experiments are time independent. That whether you do an experiment on a Tuesday or a Saturday, this is not a valid parameter of the experiment. However, this idea is suggesting something else. It's suggesting that time actually does have a quality, and that this quality, so far introduced as novelty, and its opposite, and I used to call its opposite entropy, but at Rupert Sheldrake's urging, I now call it habit. And so this is a kind of Manichaean cosmology in which habit and novelty are in a constant struggle with each other, one gaining dominance for a period of time and then the other gaining dominance in an endless dynamic relationship. The result of which, over long periods of time, is that novelty is conserved I think I used this phrase last night in the introductory talk, but without explaining the ideas which lay behind it. But the idea is that from the psychedelic point of view, or from this point of view, the universe is perceived as a kind of engine for producing and distilling and maintaining novelty, and passing novelty on to yet higher states of novelty, each level of novelty somehow allowing the emergence of properties previously forbidden at more constrained levels, so that the whole thing is a bootstrapping process to greater and greater novelty and self-reflection. Well, so that's the basic notion. Then the idea is, following the statement of the Tao Te Ching that the way that can be told of is not an unvarying way, and following the ideas implicit in the I Ching that time is a succession of irreducible elements, that time in some way is made of irreducible elements in the same way that matter has been discovered by Western science to be made of irreducible elements. So somehow time is not simply a plenum, a featureless, homogeneous surface upon which the experiments of Newtonian causality can be carried out, but actually when we look at it at the level, the fine-grained level of experience, within the context of a love affair or a dynastic family's rise and fall or something like that, we see then, that it's permeated with qualities. And in the West, these qualities were identified by the Greeks and called fate, and said, to be is to be fate-laden. Somehow the fates impinge on our lives and lead us to our destinies. Science got rid of all this, and then we just had, flying atoms whizzing around in nothingness, leading to some inevitable casuistry dictated by mathematics. Well, okay, I don't want to say too much more about the theoretics of it, but inevitably the question comes up once we get into the wave, where did you say you got this wave again? And the answer is it arose from a fairly stone circumstances, but a fairly dry problem. Meaning, I was a teacher of the order of the King Wen sequence. Now, background. The King Wen sequence is a certain arrangement of the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. And this particular arrangement is very old, found on shoulder bones, 3,500 years old and so forth. So it was simply asking a formal question. What are the rules which produce the King Wen sequence? It's always called a sequence. It's always revered as one of the oldest of human abstractions. But what in fact is the sequence? Well, in looking at that, and I won't try to lead you through it tonight, unless in a question and answer period some maniac insists. But what it boils down to is that in the King Wen sequence of the I Ching, there is embedded a fractal algorithm, a fractal algorithm very much like the fractal algorithms that have been discovered in just the past 7 or 8 years by modern mathematics using high-speed computers. But the interesting thing about this fractal algorithm inside the I Ching is that it actually appears to make good on the claim which the I Ching has always been so concerned to make, namely that it was a piece of prophetistic machinery for mapping future time. In other words, that it was a predictive engine for knowing the future. So what I brought out of it, or what I was led to find within it by the promptings of the mushroom genies, was a certain pattern that I was able to mathematically nail to the wall and define. And then all the computer does here is time scale this pattern. And then I will become the devil's advocate for this thing. And I will claim to you that this undulating wave on the screen actually describes the career of novelty in time, in all places, throughout the history of the universe. And we will look at big pieces of time, little pieces of time, and you will quickly get the idea that whether this is quote-unquote true or not, this is some kind of weird heuristic device that has about it the ozone stench of other worlds. There's a seamless completedness to it that marks it not as a discovery or an invention, but as an artifact of some other order. Well, so now let's look at the screen, and if I can come up with a pointer, and even if I can. And I'll show you how this game is played, if the software will cooperate. The software is very good. It was written by Peter Meyer. The idea existed before the software, but before the software, these screens that you're going to see, it took an entire day to make one of them, and it just left you, red-eyed and tremoring, and there was the possibility for hundreds of arithmetic errors, and any one of which would throw off the signature. So the invention of small computers in 1977 really opened this up for us. Before, we ran telephone directory size lists of numbers, which we could then look up and go off and then produce graphs somewhat like this. Okay, now I know it's hard to see, but the main thing you have to see is the line and what it's doing, and then I'll try and explain everything else and make sense of it. These are novelty units along this axis, and we've never named them, but you can think of them as escatons or whatever, whitehead-ons. But this is the important axis, and this is the time axis. Now, what's being portrayed on the screen right now is 6 billion years. 6 billion years. In other words, a time span longer than most people require for the life of this planet. The Earth is thought to have condensed around 5.5 billion years ago. And that very fact is portrayed here, because here's a convention that you have to internalize, or nothing from this point on will make sense. It's very simple, but it's somewhat counterintuitive. It's that when the line moves down, novelty is increasing. When the line moves down, novelty is increasing. When the line moves up, habit or entropy or recidivistic tendencies are increasing. Okay, well, so then looking at the life of the universe on a scale of 6 billion years, you see why I say it's an engine for the conservation of novelty. Because novelty, though there have been some severe setbacks, like here, generally novelty has been conserved. And right now, we're down in here, in this stochastic noise and damped oscillation at the very end of the cycle, so close to the zero value, which is the maximum value for novelty, that for all practical purposes at this scale, we can be said to be next to the zero value. And this is, I maintain, what accounts for the chaotic and highly novel nature of modern history, or the 20th century. It's that we are so near the zero value, the maximum value for novelty, that it's actually like there's an anticipatory image, sequential space, that it is. Well, now, let's see, God willing, we can make this thing zoom in. Zoom? Yes. So now we have 750 million years on the screen, and what was previously stochastic noise lost near the 0 point is beginning to emerge instead as a repetitious landscape of deep lunges toward novelty. So now, how to interpret this? This is about 500 million years ago. So that big downsweep was the emergence of very simple life forms. But the major career of biology has gone on along this sawtoothed trend. This is in good accordance with the fossil record. This is where the great speciations and extinctions took place after the establishment of the chordata about 500 million years ago. Okay, now I'll restart the zoom. Do you begin to get the idea of how what you as the viewer or the jury or whatever should be asking yourself is, does the wave fit my personal interpretation and understanding of novelty as we move through time? Because we're obviously, at this scale, it's pretty much up for grabs. I mean, because we're talking about such generalized events as the emergence of life and so forth. But we're going to get down on it. We're going to enter, at some point, the cognizable domains of known history. I mean, let's say since the fall of the Roman Empire, or since the fall of Richard Nixon, depending on how long your memory is. Okay, let me get this thing going again here. Here is the last 100 million years. Now, I stopped the screen here because there is an event in the last 100 million years which this thing would have to successfully predict in order to proceed further as a successful theory. It's that 65 million years ago, either there was an enormous volcanic eruption on the surface of the Earth like nothing anybody has ever seen or imagined, or there was a planetesimal impact on the North Atlantic Ridge, which seems to be the more probable candidate for what happened. And this laid down the so-called iridium barrier, and it occurred right here 65 million years ago. It's a perfect hit. In other words, the two cannot be dated precisely enough that we can't say that one is not precisely the other. So this is our first calibration here at 65 million years ago. And actually there was one earlier, I think 170 million years ago, which it also picks up, but we've shot beyond that. So now, and that was the event which caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. Nothing larger than a chicken walked away from this event on the entire planet right here. And it gave the permission for the emergence of the mammals, and the whole phyla of the Earth took a sudden different turn, which was explored along here until about 45 million years ago. And then there was some kind of carrying capacity problem, or who knows what it is. This is really approaching the height of the speciation of the age of mammals. Occurred about 35 million years ago at the bottom of this trough. Okay, so what we're looking at here is 100 million years, and this is the period in which we emerged as a species out of arboreal primates, out of bipedal proto-hominids on the grasslands of Africa. We come out of this, but most of the action for us as a thinking species is on this, this period here toward the very end, this perfect kind of volcanic-looking cone, which I call history's fractal mountain, which is sort of the signature of the whole wave, as you'll see as we get into it. Okay, now let's Again, start the zoom. 5 million years. And let's look at this. Because now what it's saying is that suddenly 5 million and slightly further back, there's large punctuation in the novelty on the planet. And we know a lot about this period. And strangely enough, what we know about this period confirms this model very closely, because what these things are known to be are glaciations, which scale, and these low points here correspond very closely with the interglacial periods. You see, what's happening is populations of human beings and animals are being locked up when the ice moves south. Then during the interglacials, these islanded populations are mixing, and you're getting movement, progressive speciation in the fossil record along at the bottom of these gradients. And it's a technical matter to match the glaciations in different parts of the world with this, but the agreement is pretty close. Or, a case can be made. 45,000 years, and let's look at this. Okay, this is a period of time where we actually begin to get artifacts, human artifacts of an interesting sort. And it's very hard to date the emergence of language, but it's interesting that one school holds that it occurred about 33,000 years ago, and that we get this very steep movement into novelty here, right there. This is probably the heyday of the Neanderthals, because this is where the population numbers of the Neanderthals seem to be the highest and found in the largest areas. But this is a glacial period, the last glacial period. And when the interglacial arrived about 19,000 years ago, you get what's called the beginning of the Magdalenian era. And this is a tremendous explosion of creativity, painting, ochre burials, ritual, musical instruments. All of these things appear on this, and this is, I maintain, where this partnership paradise, this mushroom, pastoral, feminized, ecologically dynamic and balanced society existed along this gradient here. Then it broke up around 10,000 years ago. Drying and the factors that we discussed shattered it, and there was a carrying capacity problem or something like that. Here, let's see this in a little more detail. But we're now closing distance with the cognizable domains of known history. So if the theory is going to fail, it should fail as the data accumulates and the dates become more precise. We're looking at 45,000 years, 22,000 years, 11,000 years. Let's look at this. Okay, now, what it's saying is that after this carrying capacity problem around 10,000 BC was somehow overcome, and there was a very, very steep descent into novelty, which reached its culmination around 6300 BC. Well, this corresponds very well with the dates for Çatalhöyük in Turkey, which is this Anatolian town, 9,000 years old, that achieved a level of civilization that was not seen at any other site until 1,000 or more years later. In other words, until there were civilizations establishing themselves along this gradient. This was the last bastion of the goddess partnership mushroom symbiosis. And what destroyed these people, we know, Çatalhöyük 5 was destroyed in 6500 BC by wheeled chariot people from the north. In other words, this spells the Indo-European bad guys who came from north of the Caspian Sea. And then you see this tremendous reestablishment of traditional pattern. Well, then along this gradient here, you know, when I went to school, what we were taught was history begins at Sumer. This was what we were always told, that it went Sumer, Chaldea, Babylon, Egypt. And in fact, those great patriarchal river-based civilizations established themselves on a gradient down here with Egypt right here at the bottom, establishing a new high water mark for novelty, a high water mark that would not be surpassed until the Assyrians. These are all kick-ass chariot warfare, warrior caste, you know, that rigmarole. All that's going along here. Then there's the great turning point. I mean, here again, you're seeing the signature of the algorithm, and I call it history's fractal mountain. Notice the present moment is portrayed by that much of the screen, and now we can go into this and explore parts of it. Let's look at it a little closer. 11,000 years on the screen. There's history's fractal mountain, 5,000 years. Let's look at this for a minute. Okay, this is 5,000 years. We're still targeted on today. And what it's saying is that there was clearly a great moment, a single great moment of shift at some point in the past when a series of conservative tendencies, habitual patterns of activity were, in a sense, overthrown once and for all. And even though there was plenty of shit to be slogged through from here to here, the plot was inevitable. Okay, well, so what is that point? Well, it's about 980 BC. So what was going on then? This is the shift to, it's essentially that moment when Mycenaean piracy overwhelmed the goddess religion of Minoan Crete, and the Greeks stopped being fishermen and pulled their boats up on the shore and started to talk philosophy. And that set off a cascade of cultural effects that then reverberate to this day. It comes down along this gradient. Then down here you get the fall of Rome. Then since the fall of Rome, you get this series of wildly oscillating cultural effects until as recently as the European Enlightenment in 1740, when the wave then drops to yet lower levels and begins to explore forms of novelty related to the human-machine integration and electromagnetic technology and so forth and so on. We'll look at this, but I just wanted to call your attention to this. And for another reason, there's a concept here which I haven't talked about yet, but which is good to introduce now. And that is the concept of resonance. Because this algorithm is fractal, because it is self-nested on many levels, you encounter the same topological manifold over and over again. Well, since we're looking at history, it's natural to make the analogical assumption that these repetitious topologies are somehow related to each other, so that there's suggested in this theory a series of natural nested cycles where, for instance, every 67 years, all the themes of the previous 4,306 years are somehow condensed and acted out. And it's the interface and interference patterns set up by these times in the past and in the future, sliding against each other, that create phenomena like fads and fashions and outbreaks of hysteria and weird taste things and ripples in the collective mind. Okay, so this is the signature of history's fractal mountain. Greco-Roman civilization and its spectrum of effects are this long cascade down here. Now let's look at it a little more. 1430 years. And this I wanted you to see because this is the period of history that we all know the most about. And strangely enough, the wave is very willing to make predictions in this region of history. This is one of those levels of magnification where the ebb and flow of novelty is predicted as very radical and highly punctuated. So, he looks for his crib sheet here. So when you go through this and you're trying to understand what's going on, you're supposed to have novelty occurring at the bottoms of these troughs. Well, this one in the 930s, in the 10th century, is the culmination of Islam, the creation of the caliphates of Baghdad, and and this was the one where Europe gets left out. All this mathematics and poetry and alchemy is being created down here. Then there's a series of bounce-offs, recidivist tendencies, until you get over to this one, which is about 1119. And what this is all about is it's the height of the Gothic revival and of the Crusades. The people who are active in the bottom of that thing are people like Bernard of Clairvaux, Peter Lombard, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Thomas of Becket, Pope Adrian IV, you know, all those folks famous from Masterpiece Theater. They were all happening right down there. So, you know, then the next steep descent into novelty is this one here in 1354, 56. Well, this was the greatest demographic catastrophe that Europe ever experienced. It was the Black Death. A third of the population of Europe died there. Okay, well then this one, this very steep plunge into novelty, the top up here is 1440. Gutenberg is inventing printing in Mainz near Frankfurt. And by the time you get to the bottom down here, it's 1492. The entire Italian Renaissance lies on the gradient of that plunge. So you see what the argument is, and it seems to emerge with more clarity as we have more data, is that history is actually some kind of process on a vast scale that is under the control of this particular mathematics of the species. What you get down here is the discovery of the New World, the lost half of the planet, and that sets off a round of discovery and exploration that keeps things novel for a while. But then slavery gets reestablished and a whole bunch of bad social habits take root, and it pushes it clear back up to here. But then this is the beginning of the European Enlightenment, and it descends very rapidly with then the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Restoration, all down in the bottom of this trough. Well, then let's go forward just a little bit more. The 20th century is coming up. Now there it is. Now remember how I called it history's fractal mountain, and we looked at it on a scale of 4,000 years? Well, it was this signature, or something very like it, with just slight scaling differences. Within the 20th century, from 1945 to 2012, we're recapitulating in some weird way all the themes of the previous 4,306 year cycle. So, for instance, the way this game is played, and now looking at the 20th century, we're seeing the resonances of the Egyptian cultural manifestation, and we see that they reached their culmination in 1933 to 36. So what this is saying is that the quality of this trough is a millenarian cult based on the deification of a leader figure, coupled with a hysterical obsession with tasteless architecture. And we see this set of themes played out both in Pharaonic. Each one is the resonance of the other. You see, of course, that's clearly what was going on. Well, then remember I said that the great turning point in human history was when the Mycenaean pirates squashed the Minoan goddess-loving folks and set off the cultural cascade of Greco-Roman civilization. Well, in this scheme of things, that moment happens right up here in early 1967. And of course, if you lived through that moment, you know that there was a kind of pagan revival right there, which then got smashed, and then we rode our way down into this long set of cascades into then the wild oscillation of the present. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit tonight is how we've actually entered into a new kind of time. It began about 3 or 4 years ago, 2 years ago, depending. What it has to do with is, for a long time we were on a descending gradient into ever greater novelty as we approached this asymptotically increasing novelty. Now we are so close to it that we have begun to oscillate around a mean. And this explains, the end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, a number of things. And we are going to live in this kind of time unto the culmination of the time wave itself, which occurs in 2012. The time wave is unable to make predictions past 2012 AD. One of the odd things about this revelation is its self-limiting property, because as a fractal description of a data field, it only works if you assume that the whole thing wraps itself around itself and disappears up its own gullet on December 22nd, 2012 AD, only 22 years in the future. Now we could talk about how could this be and what does it mean. What I think it means is that the presence of self-reflecting organisms, people, on this planet indicates the nearby presence or the potential imminent emergence of some higher state of organization. We are not simply the startled witnesses to this emergence of a new level of organization. Our presence here is the first indication that it's going to happen. It's almost like you can think of a pond. When the surface of the pond begins to churn, the smart money knows that something is moving toward the surface and is going to burst through. Well, history, human history, all this dream exchange and information trading and lying and so forth that goes on, is the churning of the surface of the pond. And the smart money should know, that there's a moment moving beneath the surface, that all this is presaging. And so I think this is that kind of thing, that as we approach the hyperdimensional meltdown point, or the chronosynclastic infundibulum, precursive images of it will be thrown off. I think everybody's visions now tend to take the form of totality symbols. And this is because it's constellating itself into a totality. We are so close now to the transdimensional object that it invades our dreams, our advertising, our waking fantasy, our art, our mathematics. Everything is contorted by the attraction of this transcendental object. Blake talked about this kind of thing. Anyway, now let's go in a little closer there because, well, to humor me, basically. 44 years, here's 1967. It's pointing at today, remember. 22 years, 11 years, 5 years. Now let's stop it and look at it for a minute so we can see how we're doing.
This is the last 5 years.
Well, it's not so much the last 5 years, it's pointing at today. That's today. And what we've got is 2 years, 9 months, and 16 days. It's here, here, and then here, which we haven't gotten to yet. But we've been through all of this, so let's see how we're doing. Okay, to the day, this high novelty maxima corresponds to the business in Tiananmen Square, not the massacre, which is slightly off the trough and up on this side, but the day they put 1 million people into the square peaceably is right at the bottom of that thing. Well, okay, so then we know that that ended unhappily. There was a reassertion of traditional patterns, i.e. shooting students. What could be more traditional than that? So there was a lot of that. And then that sort of peaked out. And then there was another try at a novel maxima. And at the bottom of this one, the Berlin Wall is torn down, right at the bottom of this one. So there's 2 hits in a row. Now, torn down, there were a series of revolutions. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, and then finally Romania going over the top, and that they became progressively uglier, progressively more in the traditional mold, meaning costing more life, and that week between Christmas and New Year's of last year, when the footage was coming in from the radio station in Romania, it was fairly grim. Well, that was as we went over the peak of this anti-novel or habitual thing. Then we started a long, slow meander downward, which was fairly gradual, and a lot of stuff, seemed fairly irrelevant to us. It was all about the new German order and the SNL scandal. But then we got to the bottom of this. It's not quite as deep as this. But wait, I'll move this arrow a little. Yes, there's the 27th of July. At that point, they're massed on the border and so forth. And then the invasion takes place just a few days later. Well, what can we say about the prognosis for the future based on what we're looking at?